Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the mysterious and often horrifying world of medieval kings, where the idea of royalty came with a twisted understanding of power and dominance, especially in the bedroom. Picture yourself in a grand, dimly lit chamber, the scent of opulent perfumes mingling with the unsettling atmosphere of a royal palace. A king, robed in luxurious velvet, beckons his newest bride, her innocence both prized and violated in the most shocking of ways. And you, my friend, probably won't survive this journey unscathed by the sheer brutality of what these rulers were capable of. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and the time where you are, so I can imagine where you're listening from tonight. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's not an exaggeration to say that a medieval king's obsession with virginity often reached grotesque and horrifying extremes. For the rulers of these times, the concept of virginity was not just about purity or innocence, it was a symbol of power, control, and dominance. But the lengths to which they went to ensure their wives were virgins could be chilling. The practice of inspecting a bride's virginity wasn't merely a private affair, it was a public, and sometimes violent, spectacle. Imagine this. After a marriage contract was signed and the royal festivities began, the king's officials would often perform what they called virginity tests. These tests could involve anything from painful medical examinations to even humiliatingly public displays meant to guarantee that the bride was untouched. Some historical accounts suggest that these rituals could be terrifying affairs, as the bride had to endure what could only be described as cruel and invasive practices in front of the royal court, with no regard for her personal dignity. And if she wasn't a virgin, well, the consequences could be deadly. In many instances, a bride's inability to pass this test was seen as a grave dishonor not just to her, but to the entire royal family. There are even rumors that some kings, fearing a tainted lineage, would have their wives executed if they failed the virginity test. Or worse, they'd be publicly shamed to the point of destruction. The public nature of these tests often reflected a monarch's authority over his subjects, reinforcing that even the most intimate parts of life, sexuality and reproduction, were within their grasp to control. Historians still argue whether these virginity inspections were as widespread as accounts suggest, or if they were a darker myth spun by chroniclers of the time. But what is certain is that the idea of controlling one's bloodline through the first act of intercourse held a dark and pervasive power over medieval kingships. For some monarchs, it was the ultimate expression of their rule, a display of dominance over not just their kingdom, but over the very people they ruled. The royal obsession with virginity was not just a matter of ensuring the purity of the heir, it was a matter of keeping the bloodline uncontaminated. The first night, known as the droit de seigneur in some parts of Europe, was an unwritten yet terrifying tradition. It wasn't only about the king's claim to his bride, it was about establishing his right over her body and ensuring that no other man's blood would taint the royal bloodline. The idea that a king's sexual rights were not just personal but state-sanctioned often meant that women had no say in their fate, their personal lives subjected to the whims of a ruler. The notion that the king could take the bride's first night was not just about satisfying lust, it was about power, both physical and symbolic. Even though it was widely practiced in some regions, it is debated among historians whether it was as common and institutionalized as the legends suggest. Some even believe it was embellished for the sake of sensational stories, passed down through generations to illustrate the ruthlessness of medieval monarchs. But regardless of whether it was as widely implemented as we're led to believe, it is clear that kings, in their most sinister moments, felt entitled to any woman within their realm, simply because of their position. In this grim system, the bride was often nothing more than a means to an end, a political tool used to ensure that the royal lineage continued. The king was not just a ruler, he was the absolute authority over life and death, pleasure and pain, as well as sexual agency. The practice of sexual dominance was thus woven into the very fabric of the medieval political system, where the monarch's right to sexual access was an extension of his sovereign power. And in some instances, kings weren't afraid to use that power not only to control their wives but also to punish their enemies, wielding sexuality as a weapon against both their political rivals and the women forced into their beds. Some kings even went so far as to stage these acts in front of the court. These acts were not just private affairs. They were public displays meant to reinforce the king's power and to remind everyone that his word was law. The humiliation of the bride was as much a part of the ritual as the sexual act itself. It was about reminding everyone who held the reins of power, and more importantly, about ensuring that the bloodline remained untouched by any outside influence. These shocking traditions weren't just about the king's personal lust. They were about ensuring that the monarchy's legacy, their very control over the kingdom, was never in jeopardy. The first night could mean the difference between a secure reign and a power struggle, and for the woman involved, it could mean the difference between a life of comfort and a life of trauma. The horror of the king's bedchamber was not just in the act itself, but in the unyielding power dynamics that defined these medieval monarchies. As the light flickers in the grand chamber, we move beyond just the bedchamber's rituals. The king's role in the bedroom was far more complex than you might think. It wasn't just about personal desire or lust. No, it was also a political act, full of meaning and consequence. And in the medieval world, that political act had a horrifying edge. You may be surprised to learn that a royal marriage wasn't about romantic love at all. No, it was a matter of political power. The king's bedroom was, in fact, a political stage. For kings, their marriages were not just personal unions, but diplomatic tools that strengthened alliances, ensured control over lands, and guaranteed heirs. But to ensure the bloodline was pure, many kings were forced to make sure their marriage beds were seen as a symbol of their absolute power. Their sexual activities, even their ability to perform as a man, were under scrutiny not only by their courtiers but often by the church, whose influence over the king's personal life could shape the future of the entire kingdom. Imagine this. You're standing there, watching as a royal wedding ceremony is underway. It's grand, it's lavish, but underneath all the gold and silk, there's a disturbing reality. The bride isn't just here to celebrate the union with the king, she is being watched. The first night, the consummation wasn't a private matter for most of these kings. It was a public spectacle. The court would often gather to witness the act, and it wasn't about intimacy. It was about proving that the king could still perform his duty to the kingdom. This public display, this duty, could often turn into a nightmare for the bride. Not only did she have to please the king, but she also had to do so under the watchful eyes of the courtiers, with her future as queen hanging in the balance. There's no denying that this ritual, where every act of intimacy was tied to power, was a key aspect of medieval rule. But the strange thing is, historians still argue whether these spectacles were as prevalent as they seem, or if they were exaggerated by the chroniclers of the time, keen on portraying the royals as both excessively powerful and grotesque. Regardless, the power of the king's bedroom was clear. It was a place of politics, power, and manipulation, and far too often a place of humiliation for the bride. But this wasn't the only way kings used their marriage beds as instruments of power. The monarch's ability to father an heir was paramount. For many kings, ensuring that their wives would produce children became a matter of national importance. And if their wives failed to conceive in the first few years, the consequences could be devastating. Some kings, especially those who were desperate for an heir, didn't hesitate to place the blame on their wives, accusing them of infertility or some other fault, even though they themselves might have been the ones unable to perform. This led to brutal consequences for the queens who found themselves unable to provide what their husbands wanted most, an heir to the throne. A king's lust was often intertwined with his kingdom's future, and this pressure didn't just weigh on the queens. Their entire court, the women who served them, the noble families, the advisors felt the tension. Any failure to produce a child, particularly a male heir, could plunge the kingdom into chaos. Power struggles, civil wars, and assassination plots were frequently the result of a lack of royal heirs. This dark dance between sexual dominance, political strategy, and the desperation to secure a bloodline permeated every aspect of royal life. What makes this even more disturbing is that many kings, instead of seeking out medical help or considering that they might be the ones at fault, would often turn their attention to other women, including concubines or mistresses, in a bid to produce heirs. It wasn't unusual for kings to have a harem of women, often women who were seen as nothing more than tools for their reproduction purposes. These women, sometimes referred to as royal breeders, were expected to perform their duty by providing the king with children, sometimes at the expense of their own dignity. These relationships were often formalized, but still grim. The queen, now cast aside, had little power in these situations. Her purpose was no longer to be the king's companion or his partner in marriage. She was simply the incubator of royal heirs. If she failed, she was cast aside in favor of younger, more fertile women, who were also forced into this system of sexual politics. And this wasn't just a private matter for the royal family. The public was all too aware of the pressure placed on the queen to produce an heir. The entire kingdom would watch closely, whispering about her failures, and sometimes even calling for her to be replaced. Historians still argue whether these practices were part of a broader royal culture or simply isolated incidents. Some believe that while kings may have privately engaged in these behaviors, it was far from common practice to openly display such power in the bedroom. Yet, even if only a few kings indulged in such grotesque rituals, it speaks volumes about the way sexuality, power, and politics intertwined in the royal courts of the medieval world. Kings, and even queens, were mere cogs in a larger political machine that sought to maintain the monarchy's power at any cost, often at the expense of their dignity, their health, and their humanity. Now, let's peel back the layers of what happened when royal marriages didn't just fall apart, they were tested in the most horrific of ways. When a king's wife couldn't produce a child, or worse, when her virginity was called into question, the consequences were more than just humiliation. These tests often took forms that would leave you chilled to your bones, revealing the ugly extremes to which royalty would go to assert their dominance. As it turns out, the pressure on queens and princesses to produce heirs wasn't just social, it was institutionalized. The royal courts had systems in place to ensure that every royal bed was fertile. Imagine it, a queen, freshly married, her new life in the hands of her husband, surrounded by court officials who would examine her as though she were little more than a breeding machine. If she failed to meet the king's expectations, or worse, couldn't provide an heir within the expected time frame, her status could quickly dissolve into something far darker. In some cases, the king would hire specialists, doctors, or midwives, whose sole purpose was to ensure that the queen was physically capable of bearing children. These medical professionals were not always known for their tact or expertise. They were often more concerned with making sure that the king could claim victory in the bedroom than in ensuring any real care for the queen's well-being. If the queen failed to fall pregnant, these medical experts might subject her to invasive procedures, sometimes even using painful or untested remedies, all to try to correct whatever was thought to be preventing conception. The emotional toll on these queens was immense, shamed publicly, and seen as failures if they couldn't fulfill their primary duty. But the cruelty didn't stop there. If a queen remained barren for too long, and no heir was produced, the situation could escalate to truly horrifying levels. One notorious example is the case of King Henry VIII of England, whose desperation to have a male heir led him to accuse his wives of witchcraft, infertility, or worse. Anne Boleyn, one of his most famous queens, was executed not long after failing to provide the long-desired son. And it wasn't just a matter of public disgrace sometimes. These women were pushed to the brink, facing not only legal and social condemnation, but often physical violence or even death. The king's desire for an heir was not just a personal wish. It was a kingdom-defining issue that often came with deadly consequences. But there was another side to the equation. Kings who struggled to produce heirs themselves, or who had questionable sexual prowess, often had to face the humiliation of having their manhood publicly questioned. So, what did these kings do when they faced potential embarrassment, when their ability to father a child came into question? In some cases, they would turn to an ancient solution: the king's studs. Kings often had a number of young, attractive men, known as royal studs, who were brought into the royal court for one sole purpose: to impregnate the queen or concubines if the king himself failed to produce an heir. These royal studs weren't exactly treated like lovers or even as human beings. They were essentially sperm donors, and their roles were clearly defined. The most bizarre part? Many of these men were not treated as equals. They were frequently treated as little more than royal property, exploited, used, and discarded once their service was complete. It was a humiliating and degrading experience, one where their only value lay in their ability to father children for a royal family, a job that came with no glamour or recognition. Historians still argue whether the use of royal studs was as widespread and institutionalized as it seems, or if it was more the exception than the rule. Some argue that the practice was relatively rare and may have been exaggerated by chroniclers who sought to paint medieval kings as grotesque and excessively indulgent. Others believe that this practice was, in fact, more common than we realize, especially in cultures where producing a male heir was seen as the highest achievement for any king. Regardless of its prevalence, the use of royal studs is a striking testament to how power, sexuality, and reproduction were inseparably intertwined in the royal courts of the medieval world. One can only imagine the profound sense of humiliation felt by the queens, whose role was continually undermined by these political pressures. And for the royal studs, their own dignity and humanity were stripped away as they were reduced to mere tools of reproduction. In the twisted hierarchy of medieval monarchy, sexual relationships and reproduction were not seen as intimate, personal matters. They were entirely political, with everything riding on the need for a strong heir. The idea that a royal man's seed would be tested, verified, and even replaced if it failed to produce an heir reveals the appalling way in which kings treated their wives and subjects. These practices demonstrate just how far royal families were willing to go to preserve their power, regardless of the emotional or physical toll it took on their women and men. The next chapter in this sordid tale reveals the darker sides of political power, when kings used their sexual dominance not just to ensure their bloodline, but to assert their superiority over conquered lands and their people. When a king conquered a kingdom or defeated a rival, he often claimed rights not only to the land but to its women as well, including the right to the first night with the new queen. This practice, known as jus primae noctis, or right of the first night, was one of the most disturbing and powerful forms of sexual exploitation seen in medieval times. Imagine a newly conquered queen, her kingdom now in the hands of an invading king. The night after the conquest, she is summoned to the victor's chambers, where he expects to exercise his claim over her as the ultimate symbol of his dominance. This rite wasn't just about satisfying the king's desires. It was a way for the conqueror to assert his absolute control over both the land and its people. By taking the queen, he symbolically took ownership of the entire realm, further cementing his authority over the defeated. While historical records often mention this custom in the context of ancient and medieval warfare, there remains debate among scholars about how widely this practice was actually carried out. Some suggest that it was a common practice in feudal societies, while others argue that it might have been a more mythic concept, exaggerated by writers eager to depict the cruelty of medieval monarchs. Regardless of the truth, the jus primae noctis remains a powerful symbol of the way in which sexual violence was wielded as a tool of political power. But even if it wasn't as widespread as some accounts suggest, the mere possibility that it existed is deeply unsettling. The idea that women could be treated as mere pawns in the larger game of power and conquest is both shocking and heartbreaking. The idea that an entire kingdom could be defined by such an act of humiliation and dominance speaks volumes about the way sexuality and power were intertwined in medieval politics. And yet, as much as this practice seemed like a relic of history, it didn't vanish entirely. Some versions of jus primae noctis survived in the form of royal rights to their subjects' women, or at least the concept of sexual dominance remaining an unspoken part of the monarch's authority. Many monarchs were not above exploiting their power in these ways, even if the specific rituals didn't play out as the legends describe. Moreover, as unsettling as it is to think about, the idea that this right could be used to assert control over an entire population shows just how far medieval rulers were willing to go to ensure their reigns were unchallenged. The power of a king wasn't limited to the battlefield or to the court, it extended to the very bodies of the people he ruled. This practice wasn't just about one king's dominance over one woman, it was a reflection of the deeply ingrained belief that a ruler had absolute control over his subjects, down to their most intimate lives. For the women involved, this was not just a violation of their personal freedom, it was an erasure of their very humanity. In a world where monarchs were seen as divinely ordained, the idea that they could take whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, became both terrifying and tragically normalized. While some argue that these accounts were exaggerated over time to paint medieval rulers as heartless monsters, it's clear that the idea of a king's right to sexual conquest had a lasting legacy. Even as society evolved, the notion of the king's supremacy, his ability to take anything he desired, lingered. It is a dark reminder of the lengths to which power could reach, where even the most intimate parts of a person's life were subject to royal control. At the heart of medieval royalty's sexual exploits lay a truly horrific reality. The idea that monarchs could use their power to transform the bedroom into a space for violent manipulation, humiliation, and exploitation. But it wasn't just the ritual of royal marriages that revealed the true darkness of royal rule. It was also the disturbing custom of forced sexual unions, often manipulated by the king to exert control over his subjects. This twisted ritual, where the king demanded access to his subjects' women, goes beyond mere political dominance. It reveals the absolute cruelty that these rulers were willing to enact on the bodies of those they deemed inferior. The practice of royal sexual entitlement wasn't confined to the noble classes. In some parts of Europe, the king's right to bed his subjects' daughters was almost viewed as a divine right. This meant that, under certain circumstances, a peasant's daughter could be summoned to the royal court, where she would be forced into a sexual encounter with the king. This wasn't done for any noble reason, it was all about demonstrating the ruler's omnipotence. These women were often left with no choice, no voice in the matter, their bodies treated as little more than a means of asserting the king's unchecked power. One of the most infamous examples of this practice is the idea of the droit de seigneur, or right of the lord, a law that, in some regions, granted the ruler the right to claim a bride's first night. While the exact frequency and legality of this practice remains subject to debate, the idea itself speaks volumes about the way sexuality was used as a form of power. The idea that a king could demand his subject's wife, on her wedding night no less, reveals the extent of the sexual tyranny imposed on ordinary people by the monarchy. Some historians question whether the droit de seigneur was ever more than a legend, a fantastical tale of royal cruelty woven into the fabric of medieval folklore. While there's no doubt that kings often abused their power, there's little hard evidence to suggest that this practice was institutionalized across all of medieval Europe. Yet, the widespread belief in it highlights the deeply ingrained cultural understanding that kings had an absolute right to the bodies of their subjects, an entitlement that extended far beyond the royal palace. What's more horrifying is how this notion of sexual ownership transcended the boundaries of just one ruler's personal whims. It became institutionalized in some parts of the medieval world, with women considered little more than sexual commodities, to be traded or exchanged at the whim of those in power. Even if these practices were not as widespread as some may have suggested, the idea of royal entitlement to another's body remained an unsettling truth of medieval political power. There were no defenses, no legal protections for these women, as the concept of individual rights had not yet taken hold. The overwhelming power of the king meant that no one, not even a peasant, could challenge the king's actions. The king's word was law, and his desires were the kingdom's priorities. In this bleak world, Women were subjugated not only by their social status, but by a system that empowered their rulers to treat them as objects, subject to the whims of royalty. Even though much of the information surrounding the droit de seigneur has been clouded by myth and exaggeration, it's impossible to ignore the underlying truth that these monarchs were not just rulers, they were tyrants, exercising dominance over the very essence of human life and liberty. The power to control, to dominate, and to degrade was a central part of royal rule. Historians continue to debate the exact nature of these practices, some suggesting that while kings may have had the power, it was rarely exercised in such an overt way. Others believe that it was a more widespread custom than we realize, entrenched in the societal and political structures of the time. But regardless of the specifics, the legacy of this royal entitlement echoes through history, a dark reminder of the power kings held over their subjects' bodies. The true horror lies not just in the specific practices themselves, but in the culture that allowed such actions to flourish. For medieval monarchs, power over sexuality was one of the clearest expressions of their authority. And for the women who were caught in these dark webs of royal entitlement, their bodies were nothing more than another tool for the king to wield in his struggle for dominance. Now, as we descend even further into this twisted world of medieval kings, it's time to confront a practice that's nearly as unsettling as the sexual tyranny we've already explored: the royal harem. The king's harem wasn't just a place of indulgence for the ruler, it was a breeding ground for political maneuvering, sexual exploitation, and sometimes cruelty. The women in these harems were often nothing more than commodities, their worth determined solely by their ability to fulfill the king's sexual needs and produce heirs. Imagine a king who had multiple women at his disposal, each one vying for his favor. These women weren't just lovers, they were political pawns, carefully selected from the noble classes or beyond to serve the king's desires. The king's harem was a carefully controlled space where power dynamics played out through sex, and the women within it were subjugated to the whims of the ruler. The women who were chosen to live in the harem were often there because they were seen as useful, either through their beauty, their noble bloodlines, or their ability to bear children. Their primary function was to serve the king, to produce heirs, and to maintain his image of unassailable power. At first glance, these women might appear to live a life of luxury after all. They were kept in lavish quarters and attended by servants, but beneath the surface of wealth and privilege was a life of sexual servitude. The king's mistresses and concubines were often no more than tools in a greater political game. They were expected to give birth to children, preferably sons, who could strengthen the king's claim to the throne. And when those women became pregnant, their status would rise only to fall again if they failed to conceive. In some royal courts, the harem was a highly structured system, with each woman assigned a specific role in the king's sexual life. The hierarchy of the harem was rigid, and the competition between these women could be fierce. The women who bore children for the king, especially sons, were elevated in status, often becoming the de facto queens in their own right. But for those who failed to produce heirs, there were often cruel consequences. The king might cast them aside, replacing them with younger women who were seen as more fertile or more capable of producing a royal heir. Historians still debate the true nature of these harems. While some suggest that these women lived lives of luxury, others argue that they were little more than prisoners in their own right, constantly under the scrutiny of their king and his court. There's no doubt that life in the royal harem could be both a privilege and a curse, depending on one's ability to keep the king's attention and fulfill his needs. Many of these women were not in control of their own fates. Their lives were subject to the whims of the king, and their futures were often determined by their ability to maintain their place in the royal court. What makes the harem even darker is the role of eunuchs, men who were often castrated to serve as guardians of the harem. These eunuchs were tasked with ensuring that the women in the harem remained loyal to the king, protecting the royal bloodline by preventing any unauthorized sexual encounters. The eunuchs themselves, although serving the royal family, were also victims of the system. They were forced into lives of sexual repression and forced to live without the power that comes with traditional masculinity. And yet, they were also the enforcers of sexual dominance, playing a key role in keeping the women under control. The existence of eunuchs and their role in the royal harem speaks to the deep-seated anxiety that medieval kings had about their bloodlines and sexual authority. The fear of infidelity and the desire to control the sexuality of both men and women were paramount. Eunuchs were not only seen as useful tools for maintaining the purity of the royal family, but they were also symbolic of the extreme lengths to which kings would go to preserve their power. Even though the stories of these harems are often romanticized in modern media, the reality of life inside them was grim. It wasn't about love or romance, it was about power. For the women in the harem, it was about survival. For the eunuchs, it was about subjugation. And for the king, it was about the ultimate control over not only the lives of his subjects but also over his own bloodline. Historians still argue whether the practice of royal harems was as prevalent as it was described, or whether it was exaggerated to depict the decadence of the royal courts. Some suggest that it was far rarer than previously believed, especially outside the Middle East. However, there's no doubt that the harem was an essential aspect of royal sexual politics in many cultures, with kings using it to solidify their power, assert their dominance, and ensure the continuation of their royal bloodline. The role of women in the harem also serves as a stark reminder of the deeply ingrained gender dynamics of the medieval world. These women were expected to be silent, submissive, and entirely devoted to the king's desires. Their lives were dictated by their ability to fulfill a singular, horrifying role to satisfy the king and provide him with heirs. As we delve deeper into the royal court's more sordid practices, we encounter the shocking truth about how sexual power was wielded within the confines of medieval royalty. The influence of the king over the sexual lives of his subjects extended far beyond his wives and concubines. For the rulers of the medieval world, the very idea of maintaining control over their bloodline could mean enacting brutal measures, sometimes even turning to the darkest realms of medicine and alchemy to preserve their virility and dominance. In certain periods of history, some kings, especially those who were growing older or who feared their inability to conceive heirs, turned to alchemy and potions. Medieval medicine was a strange and sometimes terrifying blend of ancient knowledge, superstition, and crude experimentation. It wasn't unusual for kings to seek out the most outlandish remedies to restore their sexual prowess, trusting in scientific concoctions that ranged from herbs and potions to even animal parts. These so-called cures often came with deadly consequences, as many of these concoctions were highly toxic or entirely ineffective. Some kings were so desperate for an heir that they subjected themselves to bizarre and painful rituals. One of the more disturbing examples involves the use of virility tests that were often conducted by court doctors. These tests could involve anything from ingesting potent potions to using instruments that were as horrific as they were ineffective. The belief that one's ability to produce heirs could be determined by mystical forces or crude physical means speaks volumes about the medieval mindset, where sexual power was equated with a king's ability to rule. What's even more chilling is the fact that these treatments often came at the expense of the wives or concubines involved. In some cases, women were subjected to the king's attempts at medical remedies, including bizarre fertility rituals that would be considered borderline torture by today's standards. Some of these practices were not only traumatic but also risky, putting the lives of the women in peril just as much as they did the king's own. These women, already subjugated by the constraints of their position, were forced to endure these treatments in the hopes of ensuring their royal duties. Modern historians continue to debate the extent to which these practices were widespread. Some suggest that while these medicinal concoctions and strange remedies were part of the king's realm of experimentation, they may have been less common than is often thought. Others believe that these remedies were more widespread, especially in an era where medical science was still in its infancy, and many rulers had little choice but to rely on whatever could be gleaned from ancient texts and dubious experts. Regardless, the link between royal sexual power and alchemical remedies remains a deeply unsettling aspect of the era, showing just how far rulers were willing to go to control their sexuality and the lives of their subjects. These bizarre and often deadly practices were part of a broader trend that saw sexual power as an essential tool of governance. In a time when political survival was often tied to one's ability to maintain a pure and uncontested bloodline, the king's virility and ability to perform sexually became a matter of public interest and political importance. The fact that a king could take such drastic measures to ensure his lineage is a reflection of just how much sexual potency was tied to the very essence of his power. What's perhaps even more disturbing is that these medical trials were often seen as necessary rites of passage for rulers. Kings, especially those who feared losing their reign to a lack of heirs, were under constant pressure to prove their virility, often through extreme and dangerous methods. But at what cost? Women were not only treated as vessels for royal bloodlines, but they were also subjected to brutal medical practices that put their lives at risk, often without their consent or knowledge. For them, the stakes were far higher than simply producing an heir. They were putting their lives on the line for the sake of royal ambition. Despite these dark practices, it's clear that the idea of a king's virility was tied up with his ability to maintain control over his kingdom. A king's sexual health was far more than a private matter. It was integral to his rule. And while some might argue that these practices were rare or exaggerated in the historical record, it's undeniable that they formed a disturbing backdrop to the lives of both kings and their subjects. The pressure to produce heirs and maintain royal power shaped the sexual politics of the medieval court in ways that were often grotesque and inhumane. As we venture even further into the twisted world of royal sexual practices, we now encounter the role that concubines played in a medieval king's life. These women were often at the very heart of royal sexual politics, acting not only as lovers but as political tools in the ongoing struggle for power, control, and the preservation of the royal bloodline. To understand the full extent of their role, it's important to recognize that concubines weren't just mistresses in the modern sense. They were integral parts of the royal structure, sometimes even more powerful than queens themselves. Concubines, unlike wives, had no official claim to the throne or royal title. Their role was essentially to bear children, preferably sons, who would further solidify the king's claim to his land and ensure that his dynasty would continue. The king's relationship with his concubines wasn't about love or affection. It was about ensuring the survival of his rule through the production of heirs. These women lived in the shadow of queens, and though they often had the king's ear and could influence his decisions, they remained outsiders to the formal royal hierarchy. What makes the role of the concubine so disturbing is the fact that these women were often treated as expendable. If one concubine failed to produce a male heir, she could be replaced with another. These women were seen not as individuals, but as mere vessels for reproduction, their fates tied directly to their fertility. The king's sexual desires were often dictated by the needs of the monarchy, rather than by any personal connection with the women involved. In many cases, concubines were chosen not for their beauty or charm, but for their ability to bear children. They were part of the royal machinery, a cog in the ongoing effort to ensure that the king's line remained unchallenged. The competition among concubines could be fierce. Women would fight for the king's favor, hoping to be the one who bore him a male heir. These women had to navigate a delicate balance between pleasing the king and maintaining their status within the court. And though they were often lavished with gifts and treated to luxury, their power was ultimately limited. A concubine's position could be usurped at any time, as the king sought new women to add to his collection, or as political alliances shifted. But the king's desire for concubines wasn't solely based on the need for heirs. There were also political motivations at play. Marriages, as we've already seen, were often used to cement alliances, but concubines were just as strategically important. The king might keep a concubine from a neighboring kingdom or noble family to strengthen his ties with them. These women acted as symbols of the king's power and influence, providing him with not just heirs, but political leverage. Historians still question how widespread the use of concubines was in certain royal courts. While some royal families had hundreds of concubines, others preferred a smaller, more exclusive group. Some scholars argue that concubinage was a common practice across all monarchies, while others contend that it was limited to certain regions and periods. What's clear, however, is that concubines were an integral part of the royal system, their roles deeply entwined with both the king's sexual life and his political power. For the women who found themselves in this position, life could be a complex mix of luxury and subjugation. They lived in the king's shadow, constantly aware that their worth was tied to their ability to bear heirs. The emotional toll of being a concubine could be devastating. While some women may have been able to wield influence and power, the majority lived in constant competition, never sure of when they might be replaced by a younger, more fertile woman. The existence of concubines sheds light on the true nature of medieval royalty, a world where power and sexual dominance were inextricably linked. For kings, maintaining a harem of concubines was not just a luxury, it was a necessity, a political tool used to maintain their rule and ensure their bloodline remained uncontested. For the women involved, however, it was often a life of uncertainty and exploitation, where their bodies were used not for love or companionship, but to fulfill the king's needs and secure the monarchy's future. Though we often romanticize the idea of royal concubines today, their lives were filled with hardship and instability. They lived in a world where their bodies were commodities, valued only for their ability to bear the king's heirs. And while some concubines might have achieved a degree of power or influence, their ultimate fate was always tied to their fertility, their status, and their ability to satisfy the king's desires. As we move deeper into the labyrinth of medieval sexual practices, we encounter one of the most unsettling and darkly fascinating aspects of royal life: the use of eunuchs. These men, often victims of cruel and violent circumstances, were not just servants, they played an integral role in maintaining the sexual order within the royal court. The king's harem, the queen's chastity, and the royal bloodline all depended on these men, who had been castrated and stripped of their sexual power in order to serve as guardians of the royal family's sexual integrity. The eunuchs were charged with keeping the women of the royal court, particularly those in the harem, under control. With their own sexual desires removed, they were thought to be the ideal caretakers of the king's women. They would oversee the women in the royal harem, ensuring that none of them engaged in unauthorized sexual activities. This gave the eunuchs an extraordinary amount of power. They controlled access to the king's most cherished possessions, his women. But, like all power within a monarchy, their influence was fleeting. Once their usefulness was exhausted, they could be discarded without a second thought. Imagine the life of a eunuch. Once a man with a future of his own, he was subjected to a traumatic procedure that stripped him of his identity and, in many cases, his agency. This procedure, often done while the man was young, could have devastating physical consequences. The castration rendered him infertile, but it also robbed him of the physical strength and virility that were highly valued in medieval society. In many ways, the eunuch existed in a state of limbo. He was neither a full man nor a woman, neither part of the royal family nor a subject of the court. He was a slave to the king's desires, a tool in the service of maintaining royal order and sexual dominance. Despite their traumatic origins, eunuchs were often trusted with responsibilities that extended far beyond their initial duties as guards of the harem. Some were placed in positions of power, acting as advisors, treasurers, or even generals. In some royal courts, eunuchs could rise to positions of extraordinary influence, wielding power over the king's finances, military, or foreign relations. Their status as non-threats in the eyes of the king made them ideal candidates for such roles, and their lack of familial attachments meant that they were thought to be more loyal to the king than any man with a wife or children. However, despite the outward appearance of power, eunuchs were ultimately slaves to the whims of the royal family. While they might enjoy brief moments of authority, they were always vulnerable to the king's displeasure. A single misstep could result in their swift removal from power or even death. This cycle of power and vulnerability is one of the darker aspects of their existence. It is hard to imagine a more dehumanizing position than that of a eunuch in the royal court, forced into servitude by the very act that stripped him of his identity, constantly at the mercy of the king and expected to suppress his own desires while overseeing the desires of others. Historians still debate the precise role eunuchs played in medieval courts. Some argue that eunuchs were used sparingly, while others suggest that they were a critical part of the royal apparatus, particularly in the Eastern courts, where their roles were more entrenched. Their presence in royal courts has been depicted as both a symbol of absolute power and a reminder of the brutal lengths to which kings would go to preserve their sexual and political dominance. Whether used as servants, advisors, or military leaders, eunuchs were ultimately the king's tools, their bodies and lives sacrificed to the whims of those in power. But despite their servile position, eunuchs have left behind an intriguing legacy. In many ways, their existence reflects the fragility of power within the royal court. They were simultaneously expendable and invaluable, servants who were both part of the royal family and its slaves. The king's need to control every aspect of his court, from the royal harem to the very bodies of his subjects, meant that even those who were emasculated could be elevated to positions of extraordinary power. And yet, this power was always precarious, dependent on the king's favor and subject to his whims. The legacy of the eunuch in medieval courts is one of power, trauma, and sacrifice. Their lives were shaped by the violence of castration and the servitude that followed, yet they were also essential to the functioning of royal power. Eunuchs, as a class, embody the paradox of power in the medieval world. Vulnerable yet powerful, loyal yet expendable, always at the mercy of those they served. In their struggle to assert their worth in a world that saw them as little more than tools, eunuchs became symbols of the darker side of royal rule, a side where control over sexuality meant control over everything. In the depths of royal power, another deeply disturbing practice emerges: the ritualistic sacrifices tied to the king's need for fertility and heirs. In a time where superstition and magic were often seen as the key to securing a strong and prosperous reign, kings and their advisors turned to the dark art of ritual sacrifice. These sacrificial acts were not just about appeasing gods or ensuring the success of battles, they were seen as necessary for ensuring the king's fertility and ability to produce heirs. A king's ability to sire children was not just a matter of royal pride, it was a matter of survival for the entire kingdom. Rituals involving virgins, often young girls, were performed in some cultures to guarantee that the king's bloodline would continue. These rituals were seen as divine interventions, believed to ensure that the king's sexual potency would remain strong and that his heirs would be healthy. The sacrifices might involve human offerings, sometimes virgins who were believed to possess the purity necessary to bring favor to the king's line. In these cultures, virginity was not just a symbol of purity, but a powerful talisman, believed to have mystical properties that could influence fertility and royal power. The exact nature of these rituals varies across different medieval cultures, but the underlying belief was the same. The king's ability to father children was intertwined with divine favor, and sacrifices were necessary to maintain that connection. Some sources suggest that in certain parts of medieval Europe and Asia, the king's court would perform elaborate ceremonies where virgins were offered to the gods. These ceremonies often took place in sacred spaces, and the virgins were sometimes killed in ways that were thought to appease the spirits or ensure that the king's bloodline would continue unhindered. In some instances, these sacrifices weren't confined to virgins. Entire villages or groups of people were sometimes chosen to be offered as sacrifices, seen as a way to protect the king and ensure the prosperity of the kingdom. The idea was that the life force of these individuals would somehow transfer to the king, ensuring that his reign would be long and his heirs would inherit a prosperous throne. In these rituals, the lives of commoners and virgins were seen as expendable, their deaths symbolizing the sacrifice needed for the survival of the monarchy. As disturbing as these practices were, they were often carried out in secrecy, hidden from the public eye. The idea that the king's sexual potency could be directly tied to the lives of his subjects was a terrifying reminder of the absolute power that medieval rulers held. The brutality of these sacrifices is a chilling reflection of the ways in which kings viewed their authority as divinely ordained, with their control over the lives of their subjects, especially women, extending into the realm of life and death. Historians remain divided over the extent to which these practices were truly widespread. Some argue that these rituals were isolated incidents, carried out by only the most desperate or superstitious kings. Others suggest that the belief in the need for such sacrifices was more pervasive, with kings in various parts of the world resorting to these dark practices as a way to maintain control over their reign. What is clear, however, is that the fear of infertility and the desperation to maintain a strong bloodline were at the heart of many medieval monarchies. And for some, these rituals were seen as the ultimate solution to ensuring that their reigns remained unchallenged. The use of human sacrifice in the context of royal fertility rituals also underscores the deep connection between sexuality and power in medieval monarchies. Kings didn't just control their wives and concubines, they controlled the very fate of their subjects, wielding their authority in ways that allowed them to take life as easily as they took a wife or a mistress. The horrifying idea that the king's sexual power could be enhanced through the blood of others speaks to the disturbing realities of royal rule during this time. These acts weren't just about securing heirs, they were about asserting dominance in the most brutal way possible, using human lives to reinforce the king's right to rule. This disturbing chapter in medieval royal life is a testament to the lengths that kings would go to in order to secure their reigns and their dynasties. The practices of human sacrifice, once thought to be relegated to ancient times, were alive and well in the dark corners of medieval courts, where kings sought out any means necessary to ensure that their bloodlines remained intact. These actions serve as a grim reminder of the brutality that can accompany absolute power, especially when sexual dominance and political authority are intertwined in such a horrific way. The gruesome practices we've uncovered so far might seem like relics of a distant and barbaric past, but the next aspect of royal sexuality we're about to explore reveals just how deeply embedded these twisted practices were in the everyday life of the monarchy. We now turn to the complex and morally disturbing relationships between medieval kings and their courtiers, especially their mistresses, who, while often romanticized in popular culture, were subjected to a life that was as emotionally and physically brutal as it was politically essential. Royal mistresses, unlike queens or concubines, had no official standing in the kingdom. They were not part of the royal bloodline, nor did they carry the political weight that a queen or a concubine might have. Yet their roles were equally important, and in some ways they were more precarious. These women often found themselves in complicated relationships with the king, existing in a world where their worth was directly tied to their ability to satisfy the king's sexual desires. While they might enjoy moments of attention, lavish gifts, and brief moments of affection, their futures were never certain. The king's relationship with his mistress was often based on a balance of power. The king would indulge in these extramarital affairs, sometimes with little regard for the women involved, while the mistresses navigated a treacherous path between being the king's object of desire and his political tool. They were not just lovers. In many cases, they were used as pawns in the royal court's larger political games. By bearing the king's children, particularly sons, mistresses could secure themselves a position of relative power within the royal court. These children, although often illegitimate, could be used as potential heirs or symbols of royal power, depending on the circumstances. But the life of a royal mistress was fraught with risk. Despite the occasional perks of royal favor, mistresses lived under constant threat. The king's affection was fleeting, and there was always the possibility of being discarded or replaced by another woman. These women were not protected by the same status or legal safeguards that queens or even concubines might enjoy. Their status was entirely dependent on their relationship with the king, and their future could change in an instant if they fell out of favor. In some instances, kings went as far as to publicly acknowledge their mistresses, elevating them to a position of prominence within the royal court. These women might be granted titles, land, or even political power, but their position remained fragile. For many mistresses, Life in the royal court was a precarious balancing act between fulfilling the king's desires and avoiding the wrath of his queen or the other women vying for his attention. In these environments, women could be pitted against one another, with their rivalry and competition often extending beyond the bedroom into the most politically charged areas of the court. Mistresses also faced the constant fear that their children would be deemed illegitimate, no matter how close their relationship with the king might have been. The legitimacy of a royal heir was everything, and mistresses' children were often viewed as expendable if they didn't conform to the king's wishes. Some were even murdered or cast aside, their potential to inherit the throne extinguished before they even had a chance to claim their birthright. The influence of royal mistresses, while often more subtle than that of queens or concubines, was still deeply entwined with the politics of the time. They could sway the king's decisions, influence his actions, and sometimes, through their children, affect the course of the kingdom's future. But all of this came at a price, one that often involved emotional manipulation, sexual servitude, and the constant risk of being abandoned at a moment's notice. Even though the lives of mistresses were often filled with luxury, they were also filled with cruelty and uncertainty. The king, who was supposed to be a figure of power and stability, became the very instrument of their suffering. These women's fates were controlled by the whims of a ruler whose affection could not be counted on, whose desires often meant their downfall. Many of these women lived and died in obscurity, their names lost to history, but their stories filled with heartbreak, ambition, and desperation remain hidden beneath the polished surface of royal life. In the grand scheme of medieval court politics, royal mistresses were often used as pawns, shuffled between kings and courtiers in a system that placed them at the mercy of their male protectors. Despite the romanticized depictions of powerful, enigmatic mistresses, the reality of their lives was one of constant insecurity. They were mere tools of the monarchy, their roles defined by their ability to satisfy the king's desires and further his bloodline. Their relationships were political, not personal, and their lives were controlled by a system that cared little for their emotions or their well-being. Historians have long debated how much power mistresses truly wielded within royal courts. Some argue that they were powerless victims, caught in a system that used them for political purposes. Others suggest that in rare instances they could influence the course of history. What remains undeniable is that their role in the royal court was deeply intertwined with the king's sexual and political power, a power that was often wielded in the most brutal of ways. As we peel back the layers of power, we come to another unsettling truth: the sexual violence that often characterized royal courts, particularly in the relationships between kings and their subjects. We've already seen how the king's sexual dominance was a tool of political manipulation, but now we turn to the darker side, when that power turned into outright abuse, and royal figures used their control over sexuality as a weapon of terror. In many cases, kings and their court officials viewed women as little more than objects to be used, manipulated, and discarded at their whim. The power to take what they desired was not only an accepted part of royal life, but it was actively wielded as a form of control. This abuse of power was not only limited to the queen or concubine, but often extended to the common women who lived under the rule of these monarchs. These women were seen as little more than resources tools to satisfy the king's desires or to strengthen his political alliances. Imagine a young woman living in a small village when word spreads that the king is coming to town. She knows what this means. She knows the king has the right to claim her as his own, to take her body in any way he desires, all because of his status as monarch. It was an unspoken but very real threat that hung over many women in medieval times. The king's power was absolute, and for some women, their bodies were not their own. They belonged to the king. No woman, no matter her social standing, was truly safe from the sexual violence of a king's whim. In some cases, these abuses were institutionalized. The right of the first night, or droit de seigneur, which allowed a lord or king to claim the first night of a newlywed woman, was one of the most brutal ways that kings asserted sexual dominance over their subjects. While the practice is debated by historians, with some suggesting it was more myth than fact, There's no denying that similar rites and practices existed in various forms across different kingdoms. These rites allowed kings to humiliate and dominate not just the women they married, but the wives of their subjects as well. Their sexual conquest became a symbol of their dominance not just in the bedroom but in every part of life. Historians continue to discuss whether the droit de seigneur was widespread, or whether it was largely a literary creation, meant to highlight the excesses and cruelty of medieval rulers. Some scholars argue that it was a rare, largely symbolic practice, while others believe it was far more common than we realize. Regardless, the existence of such a practice, whether on a large scale or not, represents a deeply troubling view of women's bodies as property, to be owned and controlled by the king. However, this sexual violence didn't always remain confined to these formal, ritualistic practices. In some cases, it manifested in much darker ways. Kings and their court officials often had the power to take any woman they pleased, whether she was a noblewoman, a peasant, or a servant. The concept of sexual violence was ingrained in the fabric of royal life, and there were no laws to protect women from such abuse. A king could rape or abuse his subjects with impunity, and in many cases, his actions would be seen as a demonstration of his unchecked power. This brutal and dehumanizing behavior extended beyond just the royal court. It was common for kings to take mistresses or concubines from the ranks of the nobility or common folk, often with little regard for the women's desires or feelings. For many of these women, their fates were determined not by their actions but by the king's needs. If the king desired them, they had little choice but to submit. For the mistresses who were kept within the royal court, their roles were frequently sexualized and objectified, serving no greater purpose than to satisfy the king's desire. It's essential to remember that these women were not just passive victims in these relationships. They were often subjected to the harshest of circumstances, trapped in a world where their worth was defined by their sexual utility to the king. The emotional toll that this would take on a woman is unimaginable, knowing that her body was never truly her own. The king's power to take what he wanted, whenever he wanted, was a constant reminder of the sexual violence that defined so much of royal rule. While the exact scale of these abuses remains unclear, their existence cannot be denied. The king's ability to exert control over the bodies of his subjects, including through sexual violence, was one of the most terrifying aspects of medieval life. This abuse wasn't just about physical domination, it was about stripping away the dignity and humanity of women, reducing them to mere vessels for the king's sexual and political needs. In the grand scheme of things, this brutal sexual violence was a reflection of the king's absolute power. His control over his kingdom extended beyond the battlefield and the courtrooms. It reached into the most intimate aspects of his subjects' lives. The sexual abuse of women, particularly those at the mercy of the king, reveals a chilling truth about how power was used during the medieval period. Kings were not just rulers, they were tyrants who wielded their authority with brutality, and women were often the most vulnerable victims of this unchecked power. As we continue our descent into the darkest corners of royal sexuality, we now confront a chilling reality: the normalization of infidelity and sexual excess in medieval courts. Kings, surrounded by power and privilege, were often encouraged, if not expected, to indulge in sexual adventures that went far beyond the boundaries of marriage. These kings often had multiple mistresses, lovers, and concubines, whose existence wasn't just accepted, it was sanctioned. Infidelity wasn't just a private matter, it was woven into the very fabric of royal life, often seen as a mark of a ruler's virility and dominance. Imagine living in a world where infidelity wasn't a cause for scandal, but a display of a king's prowess. In many royal courts, it was considered not just permissible but expected for kings to engage in numerous sexual affairs. It wasn't about love or romance. It was about power, about asserting dominance over one's court, over one's subjects, and even over one's wife. The queen, while married to the king, had no real claim to her husband's loyalty, and her value was often defined by her ability to produce heirs. The king's infidelities were, in many ways, an open secret, a reflection of his control over the kingdom and his ability to command the bodies of his subjects. What's perhaps even more disturbing is how these affairs were not just tolerated, they were encouraged. Kings were often surrounded by advisors who saw these sexual conquests as a way to strengthen the monarchy's position. A well-placed affair with the daughter of a powerful nobleman could solidify political alliances, while a series of mistresses might serve as a constant reminder of the king's wealth and power. These affairs weren't merely private indiscretions, they were often used as strategic tools to further the king's political agenda, and for the women involved, they were a necessary evil to maintain their status. But beyond the political maneuvering, these affairs often came with a terrible price. The women who became entangled with the king often did so at great personal cost. While some women may have been willing participants, many others had no choice but to submit to the king's desires, either out of fear or because they were beholden to his power. For the women who bore the king's children, their lives were forever marked by the illegitimacy of their offspring, often seen as little more than pawns in the royal game. These children, despite their royal blood, were often left in the shadows, their futures uncertain as their legitimacy was constantly called into question. What's even more chilling is that these infidelities weren't just about the king's desire for pleasure, they were deeply entwined with the idea of control. The king's sexual exploits were not simply a matter of satisfying personal desires. They were a way for the king to assert his power over both his court and his kingdom. The more women a king took as mistresses, the more his dominance over his realm was emphasized. Sexuality was a tool one that the king wielded to maintain control, manipulate power, and create a legacy that was tied not just to his political rule, but to his sexual prowess as well. But these affairs were not without their consequences. The women who participated in these relationships often suffered both socially and emotionally. Many were shunned by the royal court, cast aside when the king grew tired of them, or forced to live in the shadow of his other lovers. In a world where a king's favor could make or break a woman's status, these mistresses lived in constant fear of being replaced, their futures uncertain and often fleeting. Their worth was determined by their ability to satisfy the king's sexual needs, and once that usefulness expired, they were cast aside, forgotten by history, just as easily as they had been summoned into the king's bedchamber. Historians still debate the true extent of these affairs. Some argue that royal infidelity was more widespread than we think, with kings indulging in countless sexual exploits throughout their reigns. Others suggest that, while kings were undoubtedly promiscuous, the true scale of their affairs may have been exaggerated by chroniclers. Still, it's clear that infidelity was not just a part of royal life, it was a central feature of it. The king's ability to take multiple lovers, mistress after mistress, was seen as a symbol of his power, and in the eyes of his court, it reinforced his authority. But this sexual excess wasn't without its toll. For the women involved, their lives were often shaped by the whims of a monarch who saw them as little more than instruments to maintain his power. These women had no true agency. They were there to satisfy the king's desires, and once they no longer served that purpose, they were discarded without hesitation. The normalization of infidelity and sexual excess within the royal courts of medieval times speaks volumes about the way power and sexuality were intertwined. The king's reign wasn't just about military victories or political maneuvering. It was also about his ability to control the sexual lives of those around him. For the king, sexual exploits weren't just personal indulgences, they were a tool for maintaining dominance, manipulating political alliances, and solidifying his place as the ultimate authority. As we continue exploring the intricacies of royal sexual dynamics, we now turn to a chilling aspect of medieval kingship, the systematic use of sexual violence as a tool of power. While we've seen how kings wielded control over the lives of their wives, concubines, and even their subjects, there's a more insidious practice to address: the sexual abuse that monarchs would inflict upon their own people. In the medieval world, the king's power was absolute, and this control extended to sexual relationships that were not only illicit but often forced. The idea that a king could exercise unchecked authority over his kingdom's population, especially its women, was deeply ingrained in the feudal system. A king, as ruler, was often seen as having divine rights, anointed by God himself. This belief gave kings an unparalleled sense of entitlement, not only to their land and wealth, but to the bodies of their subjects. The king's power was so absolute that his sexual desires were not seen as offenses, but as extensions of his sovereignty. This concept, while deeply unsettling, was accepted by many medieval societies. One of the most horrifying aspects of this abuse was the use of jus primae noctis, or right of the first night. While the historical reality of this practice is debated, the idea itself reveals just how ingrained the abuse of power was. The notion that a king had the right to claim a bride's virginity on her wedding night wasn't just an assault on the individual, it was an assertion of ownership over the very people in the kingdom. This practice, if it were as widespread as suggested, would have had devastating psychological and emotional impacts on the women subjected to it. Beyond the jus primae noctis, there are disturbing accounts of kings who would take the wives and daughters of their subjects without consent. These women, often from lower classes, had no means of protecting themselves from the king's advances. A king's desire could be sated at any time, with no regard for the woman's will. For these women, the possibility of being summoned to the royal court and subjected to the king's desires was a constant terror. Even though kings often sought to create political alliances through marriages, these women, whose marriages were supposed to ensure stability and peace, were sometimes reduced to pawns in a much darker game. This sexual violence wasn't just a private affair. It was a public display of the king's unchallenged power. In some cases, kings would flaunt their power by taking any woman they desired, humiliating their subjects and showing them that no one was beyond the king's reach. In many instances, these women were powerless to fight back. They could only submit to the king's will, or face disgrace, punishment, or even death. Their fates were determined by the whims of a man who saw himself as above reproach, his actions justified by his status and divine right. While there is a certain degree of myth surrounding these practices, it is clear that monarchs used their authority to subjugate women and reinforce their control. In the most extreme cases, sexual violence was institutionalized, as seen in the widespread abuses of power during times of war and conquest. For kings who ruled over newly acquired lands, the right to claim their subjects' women was seen as an extension of their victory. The humiliation of these women was not just a personal act of sexual violence, it was a symbol of the king's ultimate conquest, his victory not just over land but over human beings. The impact of this sexual violence on the women involved was immeasurable. These were not isolated incidents of personal betrayal. They were reflections of a system in which the king's authority was absolute, and his desires, no matter how grotesque, were seen as sacred. The lives of these women were determined by the king's needs, and their suffering was a testament to the power of absolute monarchy. This abuse of power was not just a symptom of a corrupt system, it was the very essence of that system, a reflection of a political structure in which women were seen as tools for the king's gratification and control. Even though modern historians continue to question the exact extent of these practices, it's clear that sexual violence played a central role in the dynamics of royal power. For some monarchs, their ability to claim women, whether through forced marriages or other means, was seen as a demonstration of their strength and divine right to rule. It wasn't just about satisfying lust, it was about sending a message to their subjects that they had the power to take whatever they wanted, including the most intimate aspects of life. The king's sexual violence wasn't an isolated event, it was woven into the very fabric of the monarchy. As we reflect on this brutal abuse of power, it's important to recognize the deep, lasting effects it had on those who lived under such tyrannical rule. These women, forced into submission, became symbols of the horrors that could arise when power was unchecked. The legacy of this violence, though it may have been buried by time, continues to resonate in our understanding of the ways that authority and abuse intersected in the medieval world. As we approach the final layers of this grim narrative, we begin to uncover the tragic fates of women who were not only used as pawns in the royal game, but were also discarded, once their purpose had been served. The legacy of royal sexuality is not only defined by the acts of power, but also by the consequences faced by those who were caught in the tangled web of royal rule. The women who were subjected to sexual exploitation often faced lives of instability, rejection, and in many cases, untimely deaths. Their suffering is one of the darkest parts of medieval history, highlighting just how expendable they were in the eyes of the king. Once a king's mistress or concubine lost his favor, she was often cast aside without ceremony. Though some women were fortunate enough to secure a place in royal favor for years, sometimes even influencing court politics, the vast majority lived at the mercy of the king's whims. A mistress, once cherished, could just as quickly be abandoned when the king grew tired of her, or when a new woman captured his attention. This constant cycle of favor and rejection placed these women in a precarious position where their futures were uncertain and their fates were often tragic. Some concubines, especially those who bore the king's children, could be given some degree of power or protection, but many others were left to live in obscurity. They were often pushed aside for younger, more attractive women, or replaced when the king's political needs changed. The emotional toll of this constant uncertainty was immense, and many of these women struggled to find a stable position in the royal court once they had been discarded. In some instances, women who were once powerful figures in the king's life were reduced to mere shadows, forgotten by history. For those women who bore the king's children, the situation was equally dire. Even if the child was royal by blood, it didn't guarantee a place in the royal lineage. Bastards, especially those born to concubines or mistresses, were often treated as second-class citizens, their claim to the throne seen as illegitimate. In many cases, these children were left to grow up in the shadow of their royal bloodline, never fully accepted or recognized by the king. Though some bastards were later acknowledged and even given titles, their futures were often uncertain and fraught with political intrigue. But even more tragic were the fates of women who were discarded entirely. Once a woman had served her purpose, whether by providing a child, solidifying a political alliance, or satisfying the king's desires, she was often cast aside, left to live a life of insignificance. Many of these women had no means of support once they were removed from the king's favor. With no titles, no protection, and no social standing, they were left to fend for themselves in a world that had no place for them. Some might have returned to their families, while others were forced to live in obscurity or poverty, their once prominent positions reduced to nothing. It's important to understand that these women were not just victims of personal relationships, they were victims of a system that saw them as disposable. The power dynamics of medieval courts, where men held absolute control, treated these women as tools to be used and discarded. Their bodies were exploited, their futures uncertain, and their lives shaped by the whims of the king. Historians have long debated the fate of these women, and while some suggest that their experiences were relatively rare, others argue that their suffering was more widespread than we realize. The women who fell out of favor with the king often faced an uncertain future, and the social and political realities of medieval life ensured that their fate was often bleak. These women were forced to navigate a treacherous world where their worth was determined by their ability to maintain the king's attention. Once that attention was lost, they were often left to fade into the background, forgotten by the court, and left to suffer in silence. What remains clear, however, is the profound impact that the king's sexual power had on these women. Their lives were defined by their ability to please the king, and once that ability faded, so did their place in the royal world. The consequences of this system were devastating, leaving many women with no real agency or power in a world that treated them as expendable objects. The legacy of these women, those who were discarded and forgotten, speaks to the heart of the cruelty that defined royal rule during this time. The king's sexual desires were not just a personal indulgence, they were tied to his power, and the women who were subjected to his whims paid a heavy price. Their fates serve as a reminder of how easily power can be abused, and how those at the mercy of kings were often left to suffer in the shadows of history. As we turn to the final chapter of our exploration, we must consider the legacy of medieval kingship and its sexual abuses. While the specific actions of individual kings might differ, the underlying patterns of exploitation, control, and degradation was strikingly consistent. In the context of medieval rule, sexuality wasn't just a private matter, it was a political tool, a means of asserting dominance, and a way to maintain control over not just the royal family, but the entire kingdom. Kings wielded their sexual power with devastating force, and the women who became the objects of their desires often paid the price. The true horror of medieval royal sexuality lies not just in the specific practices such as forced marriages, sexual violence, and the exploitation of concubines, but in the system that supported them. This system was built on the belief that kings were not just rulers of their people, but also their absolute masters. They had dominion over everything in their kingdoms, including the bodies of their subjects. This belief was deeply entrenched in medieval society, where the concept of divine right gave kings absolute power, and their sexual desires were seen as extensions of that divine authority. For the women who were caught in this web of power, their lives were often reduced to nothing more than a series of roles designed to serve the king's needs. The queen, the concubine, the mistress each had her place, each her role to play in the royal drama. And for the vast majority of these women, their personal desires, their emotional needs, and even their survival were secondary to the political aims of the monarchy. These women were often treated as disposable, their futures inextricably linked to the whims of the king. The system that allowed this abuse to thrive wasn't just about the power of individual kings, it was about the larger political system that supported them. The feudal system, with its rigid hierarchy and deeply ingrained patriarchy, reinforced the belief that the king's authority was absolute and that his sexual desires were a natural extension of that power. This belief justified the abuse of women in the royal court, as well as the widespread violence that accompanied it. Women, particularly those in lower social classes, were seen as objects to be used, traded, and discarded by the king and his court. As much as the king's sexual violence was an act of personal desire, it was also a means of maintaining political power. The king's ability to control the bodies of his subjects, to manipulate political alliances through marriage, and to force women into sexual relationships, was all tied to his need to project authority and maintain control. The very notion of royal power was built on the exploitation of women, who were seen not as individuals, but as instruments in the royal game. Their sexual exploitation was an accepted part of the royal system, and the women who suffered under it had little recourse. This culture of sexual exploitation and violence had lasting effects on medieval society. It reinforced a social structure where women had little agency and were at the mercy of powerful men. These women, queens, concubines, mistresses, and commoners, were often forced to navigate a world where their bodies were treated as political tools. Their fates were determined not by their own actions, but by the whims of the king and the political system that upheld him. The legacy of this system is not just found in the stories of individual kings, but in the broader historical context of feudalism and monarchy. The violence and exploitation that these women experienced were not isolated incidents. They were a part of the very structure of power that governed the medieval world. This system perpetuated a cycle of abuse, where the king's sexual dominance was an integral part of his rule, and where women's lives were defined by their ability to fulfill his desires. Historians continue to examine the impact of royal sexual practices on medieval society, and while the specifics of each case may differ, the broader patterns are undeniable. The abuse of power, the sexual violence, and the dehumanization of women were not aberrations, they were central to the way that monarchy functioned. For centuries, kings used their sexual power to maintain control, and in doing so, they created a legacy of exploitation and suffering that affected countless women. As we look back on this dark chapter in history, it's important to recognize the resilience of the women who lived through it. Their stories are often buried in the shadows of history, overshadowed by the men who held power over them. But their experiences of violence, exploitation, and humiliation are a reminder of the ways in which power and control have been used to subjugate those at the bottom of the social ladder. While the kings who wielded such power may have been remembered as heroes or rulers, the women who suffered at their hands remain silent, their stories largely untold. The history of medieval kingship is not just a story of power and conquest, it is also a story of the ways in which women's bodies were used, abused, and exploited in the name of royal authority. As we close this chapter, let us remember the voices that have been silenced by the oppressive power of the monarchy, and reflect on the lasting legacy of the sexual exploitation that was so deeply entrenched in medieval life. As we near the conclusion of our journey through the horrifying world of medieval royal sexuality, we must acknowledge the lasting impact that these practices had on the way sexual power was understood and maintained. Though these abuses took place in an era long past, their reverberations can still be felt in the structures of power and control that exist today. The exploitation of women, the normalization of sexual violence, and the use of sexuality as a tool of political dominance were not just transient elements of medieval life, they were foundational to the monarchies that shaped the medieval world. One of the most lasting legacies of medieval sexual power was the way it reinforced gender inequalities. The idea that men, particularly kings, had absolute control over the sexual lives of women set the stage for centuries of patriarchal dominance. In medieval times, a woman's value was often determined by her ability to fulfill sexual and reproductive roles, whether as a wife, a mistress, a concubine, or even a victim. This understanding of women's roles didn't just disappear when monarchies crumbled. Instead, it evolved and persisted in new forms, continuing to shape gender dynamics and power structures throughout history. Kings weren't the only men who benefited from this system. Noblemen, lords, and other powerful figures often adopted similar tactics to assert their dominance. The feudal system, which placed power firmly in the hands of the few, allowed for the exploitation of women on every level of society. The abuse of power by kings trickled down to other levels of society, reinforcing a culture of sexual violence and subjugation that affected both the royal and the commoner classes. The social structures that allowed these abuses to occur were not just confined to medieval courts. The idea of sexual entitlement of men owning women's bodies and using them to assert dominance was, and in many ways still is, deeply ingrained in patriarchal societies. While laws and social norms have evolved, the history of sexual violence and the exploitation of women by those in power continues to be a troubling part of many societies. The institutionalization of sexual violence also contributed to the normalization of rape and sexual abuse in various forms. Women's bodies were often viewed as property to be controlled and used at the will of the powerful, whether that be the king, the nobleman, or the lord. This dehumanization didn't only affect women within royal courts, it also reinforced the broader societal view of women as secondary, their rights and autonomy stripped away in favor of maintaining male power. While some argue that modern society has moved away from these practices, it's essential to recognize how deeply rooted these patterns are. The monarchs and kings who used their sexual power as a tool for control set the stage for centuries of sexual abuse that would go largely unchallenged. The normalization of sexual violence and the control of women's bodies created a framework that allowed for the continuation of these practices in different forms, from political corruption to everyday abuse. Today, the remnants of these old power structures still influence how we view authority, gender, and sexuality. Monarchs may no longer rule with the absolute power that they once held, but the systems of patriarchy that were cemented during this time continue to impact women's rights and freedoms. The sexual exploitation of women by kings and other powerful men was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger societal system that saw women as tools for male power and control. In reflecting on this history, we can see how sexual violence and power are intrinsically linked. The practices we've discussed, the forced marriages, the sexual violence, the use of women as pawns in political games, were not just about physical dominance. They were about creating and maintaining a system where power and control were maintained through the exploitation of women. These acts of sexual dominance weren't isolated, they were part of the very fabric of royal rule. In the end, the legacy of these medieval practices is one of cruelty and subjugation. The kings and monarchs who ruled during this period may be remembered for their power and their conquests, But the women who suffered under their rule have largely been forgotten. Their stories remain largely untold, their suffering buried in the pages of history. The exploitation of women's bodies, however, remains a central part of the history of power, and it's a story that continues to unfold in many ways today. While we may not live in a world where kings rule with unchecked authority, the systems of power and control that allowed these abuses to thrive still exist. In order to truly understand the legacy of medieval kingship, we must confront the ways in which sexual power continues to shape our world and recognize the ongoing struggles for gender equality and the rights of women. The past may be behind us, but the echoes of these abuses can still be felt, reminding us that the fight for women's autonomy and dignity is far from over. As we move forward in this dark history, we must confront a crucial part of the royal experience: how kings wielded their sexuality to maintain dominance, both over their kingdom and their court. While the actions we've discussed were brutal and often deeply exploitative, the truth is that the king's control over their sexual lives was often seen as an essential part of their power. This wasn't just about personal indulgence, it was about reinforcing authority, establishing political alliances, and maintaining control over both the royal family and the subjects. One of the most unsettling aspects of royal sexuality was how it was enmeshed with the broader political system. Kings didn't just marry for love or alliance, their marriages were tools to solidify their reign. The pressure to produce heirs wasn't just personal, it was societal. The king's ability to create a legitimate bloodline was directly tied to the survival of the monarchy. If a king failed to produce a male heir, his reign could be seen as weak, his bloodline illegitimate. And so the sexual lives of kings became a public affair, the pressure mounting for them to produce offspring. But the consequences of failure were often horrific. A queen who failed to bear children, particularly a son, could find herself in danger. Her status could be revoked, her position in jeopardy. Some kings, anxious to maintain their royal status, would quickly turn on their wives or concubines, seeking new women to try to produce heirs. These decisions weren't personal, they were political. The women caught in these power struggles were forced to navigate a court where their worth was entirely tied to their ability to reproduce. While the primary goal for kings was to secure heirs, the dynamics of power weren't limited to reproduction. Kings often used their sexual relationships to forge alliances with other noble families or territories. A royal marriage was as much a strategic political move as a personal bond, and when the king's primary wife couldn't fulfill the role of producing heirs, he might turn to concubines, mistresses, or even women from rival courts to ensure his bloodline continued. The sexual relationships between kings and these women weren't just about lust, they were about consolidating power and reinforcing the king's control over his kingdom. The practice of taking concubines and mistresses was not just about satisfying the king's desires, it was an extension of his authority. By taking women from powerful families, or even from outside the kingdom, kings could cement political relationships that bolstered their reign. These women were more than lovers, they were political tools. While they might not have had the same official standing as queens, they were integral to the king's strategy. But these women were also at the mercy of the king's desires. Once they had fulfilled their purpose, producing an heir or solidifying an alliance, many of them were discarded, forgotten, or even cast aside in favor of new women. But the legacy of these sexual politics wasn't just about the king's use of women as tools in his political games. It was also about how the women themselves were often seen as expendable. Their worth was determined by their ability to bear children and to further the king's dynasty. Women who failed in these tasks could be replaced with little fanfare. And even those who succeeded in giving the king an heir were not guaranteed protection from the whims of the monarch. They could still be pushed aside for younger, more fertile women, their roles reduced to mere breeders for the royal line. Even more disturbing was the emotional toll this system took on these women. Their lives were not their own. They were subject to the whims of the king and the needs of the monarchy. Their futures were uncertain, and their identities were often defined by their ability to fulfill a singular, often brutal, purpose. The psychological impact of being used for political gain cannot be overstated. For many of these women, their lives were marked by the knowledge that they were pawns in a larger game, their bodies nothing more than tools to further the power of the king. Despite the trauma these women endured, the monarchy continued to thrive by using sexuality as a weapon of control. Kings manipulated the political landscape through their sexual relationships, securing their rule by strategically using marriage, concubinage, and mistresses. Their sexual power, however, came at a staggering cost, not just to the women involved, but to the entire social fabric of the kingdom. The idea that royal sexuality could shape the future of a kingdom speaks to the dark, lasting legacy of medieval kingship, where power was intimately tied to the control over women's bodies and reproductive futures. Historians still argue whether these sexual power plays were as institutionalized as they seem, or whether the records have exaggerated the extent to which kings used their sexuality as a tool for dominance. Some suggest that the dynamics of medieval courts weren't as openly exploitative as it's often depicted, while others believe the sexual manipulation of power was far more widespread. Regardless of the details, one thing is clear. The intimate lives of medieval monarchs were profoundly intertwined with the politics of their kingdoms, and the exploitation of women was both a tool and a consequence of their power. As we venture deeper into the murky world of medieval kingship, we must acknowledge the unspeakable cost of this sexual control. The legacy of trauma passed down through generations of women, subjected to the whims of monarchs. The kings who wielded their sexual power often had no regard for the emotional and physical toll they inflicted on their wives, concubines, and subjects. For these women, the king's desires were not just a matter of personal injury. They were the foundation of a violent system that stripped them of their agency, their dignity, and sometimes even their lives. For many of these women, the cost of being a pawn in the royal game was incredibly high. The emotional abuse they suffered often went hand in hand with the physical toll. The lives of queens and concubines were often marked by isolation, humiliation, and an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. They were expected to satisfy the king's desires and produce heirs, preferably male, but they were rarely allowed to experience the joy or freedom of sexual autonomy. Their worth was measured solely by their ability to meet the king's needs, and when they failed, their position in the royal court became uncertain. Take, for example, the life of a royal mistress. While she might have enjoyed temporary favor and luxury, her future was always precarious. If the king became bored or replaced her with a younger woman, she would be cast aside without hesitation. The emotional scars from being used as a political tool and discarded when no longer deemed useful were profound. Many of these women spent their lives in uncertainty, knowing that their position in the court depended entirely on the king's shifting whims. But it wasn't just the women of the royal court who suffered under this system of sexual control. For the common women in the kingdom, the king's power to claim their bodies extended into their everyday lives. The idea that a king could take any woman, whether from the nobility or from the common people, was a deeply ingrained belief that helped perpetuate systems of violence. The king's sexual conquest became a symbol of his unchallenged authority, a reminder to the entire kingdom of the king's absolute power. Women who were forcibly taken by the king or his men were left to suffer in silence, their lives forever shaped by their exploitation. Even the children born of these relationships were not exempt from the legacy of trauma. While some royal bastards were elevated to positions of power, many others were left to live in obscurity, ignored or treated as illegitimate heirs to the throne. The constant tension between legitimate heirs and illegitimate ones created an atmosphere of uncertainty and rivalry that often led to bitter infighting within royal families. The lives of these children, particularly those born from forced sexual relationships, were defined by the stigma of their birth. Their legitimacy was always questioned, and their futures were never certain. The consequences of these abuses didn't just end with the women and children who were directly involved. The entire kingdom suffered from the toxic power dynamics created by kings who treated sexuality as a tool of dominance. The normalization of sexual violence within the royal court spread throughout society, creating a culture where women's bodies were seen as the property of men. This system of patriarchy not only allowed for the exploitation of women but also reinforced a broader societal belief that men had the right to control women's lives physically, emotionally, and politically. In many ways, this legacy of sexual violence and control extended far beyond medieval times. The idea that women were to be controlled, that their bodies were a currency for political power, became embedded in the very fabric of society. The social structures that allowed these abuses to thrive became the foundation for centuries of gender inequality, with women consistently placed at the mercy of male power. The echoes of these historical abuses can still be heard today, in modern struggles for women's rights and the ongoing fight for sexual autonomy. Historians continue to examine the extent of these abuses, and while the specific details may vary, the underlying truth remains the same. The sexual control wielded by kings was not just an isolated aspect of their rule, it was central to the way they governed. The way a king controlled his wives, concubines, and subjects was a direct reflection of his power and authority. The exploitation of women's bodies, the manipulation of sexuality as a political tool, and the normalization of sexual violence were all deeply embedded in the power structures of medieval monarchy. The legacy of medieval royal sexuality is not only found in the individual stories of power and manipulation, but also in the broader cultural and societal shifts that these practices instigated. Sexuality, when used as a tool of political power, reverberated through every aspect of royal life, from the courtrooms to the common homes. Monarchs had the ability to shape the very fabric of society, and their sexual relations became a public matter, an expression of their power and a symbol of their dominion. For many women within the court, this public scrutiny was a harsh reality. The intimate lives of the queens, mistresses, and concubines were not merely personal, they were tied to the survival of the monarchy itself. These women were part of a system that viewed them not as individuals, but as instruments for the continuation of the royal line. Their value was defined by their ability to produce heirs, and their entire lives were governed by the expectations placed on their bodies. For these women, the personal and the political were inseparable. But the impacts of royal sexual exploitation didn't stop at the royal chambers. These practices were modeled throughout society, creating a system of expectations where women's roles were defined by their relationship to men, specifically to the men in power. The idea that a woman's primary function was to serve as a vehicle for the king's heirs translated to a wider cultural perception that women were there to satisfy the needs of men. This view, ingrained in society, didn't fade with the fall of monarchy. It persisted, slowly evolving into the patriarchal systems that we still grapple with today. Monarchs used their sexual lives not only to reinforce political power, but also to maintain their authority over the entire kingdom. Whether through alliances made by marriage, the use of mistresses to solidify political relations, or the mere act of sexual dominance, kings used sexuality to remind their subjects of their absolute control. Their ability to claim women as their own symbolized their unchallenged power. And just as kings held sway over their courtiers, so too did they hold dominion over the common people, where social hierarchies were reinforced by the king's sexual access to women. While the direct sexual violence committed by monarchs might seem like something consigned to history, the social and cultural structures that allowed such practices to thrive continued to shape the gender dynamics of future generations. The control over women's bodies, the normalization of sexual dominance, and the idea that women's worth was tied to their reproductive abilities left an indelible mark on the ways women were treated across centuries. Though these brutal practices may have shifted over time, the legacy of medieval sexuality reminds us of how deeply power dynamics can influence social norms. In societies still grappling with gender inequality, the echoes of these historical abuses remain present. From laws and cultural practices to modern-day struggles for women's rights, the shadows of royal sexuality continue to loom large, a reminder of how far-reaching the effects of unchecked power can be. The pervasiveness of sexual control within royal courts wasn't merely a matter of individual kings or isolated incidents, it was systemic, affecting every aspect of governance, social structures, and even the laws that governed the land. The royal family, especially the monarch, was the pinnacle of this power dynamic, where authority was not just exercised in politics, war, or economics, but through control of sexual relations. Kings often used their position to validate their actions, transforming what would otherwise be seen as inappropriate or violent into something sacred, even justified. This distortion of power didn't just affect the women in the king's immediate circle, it rippled outwards into the nobility and beyond, influencing the entire kingdom. If a king could assert control over the most intimate aspects of his life, then it followed that lesser men could claim the same over their wives, daughters, and even their servants. This was not just a cultural phenomenon, it was codified into the political and legal structures of medieval society. A woman's body, her sexuality, and her reproductive ability became the property of those in power. Take, for instance, the ways that royal marriages were often political transactions, devoid of personal choice or affection. When a king married a foreign princess, her body was not her own. It was seen as part of a diplomatic agreement, a tool to further alliances and strengthen the royal bloodline. The king's personal desires took precedence, and the queen's duty was often solely to produce heirs. If she failed in this, as we've seen time and again, she might be discarded, her personal worth nullified. Her emotional well-being was irrelevant compared to her ability to fulfill her reproductive role. But the abuse extended beyond just political marriages. Concubines, mistresses, and even women from noble families were often used to solidify royal power. When a king sought to strengthen a relationship with a neighboring kingdom, he might take a mistress from a noble family, thus ensuring the loyalty of that family. These women, much like their royal counterparts, were used as bargaining chips in the game of political maneuvering. Their autonomy was stripped away, and their roles reduced to their ability to bear children or their usefulness in furthering political goals. Even the common women, those far removed from the royal court, weren't spared from the consequences of this systemic abuse of power. The cultural normalization of male sexual dominance trickled down to them too. In the feudal system, where power was distributed unequally, the sexual exploitation of common women was seen as a natural extension of the power that men held over their lives. It wasn't just kings or lords who believed they had a right to women's bodies. It became ingrained in the social fabric. Women, particularly lower-class women, were often seen as objects, tools for reproduction, objects for men's pleasure, and instruments for securing power. This widespread exploitation wasn't just a feature of the royal courts, it was part of the very structure that allowed monarchy to exist. The belief that men had the right to control women's bodies mirrored the larger societal structures in place, where power was often maintained through dominance and control. These systems were designed to perpetuate inequality, and the use of sexual power was one of the most effective ways to do so. While the kings and queens of medieval Europe may have lived in opulent palaces, their subjects often lived in dire conditions, their fates shaped by the whims of those who wielded power. The legacy of sexual exploitation within royal courts was not just about the kings themselves, but about the way it shaped the social hierarchies and gender dynamics of the entire kingdom. The system that allowed for these abuses was deeply entrenched, and its echoes can still be heard today, in the ways societies continue to struggle with gender inequality and the exploitation of women. The trauma and suffering endured by countless women in these systems were often erased from history, overshadowed by the exploits and legacies of powerful men. But these women's experiences were not just sidelined, they were intentionally buried. For centuries, the true cost of royal power and sexual dominance was hidden behind the glossy narratives of kings and queens. It's only through reflecting on these abuses, recognizing their existence, and acknowledging their impact that we can begin to understand the full scope of how power was wielded and how it still shapes our world. In revisiting these histories, we're not just learning about the past, we're confronting the ongoing struggle against a system that still exerts its influence in many parts of the world. The power dynamics created in the royal courts of medieval times may have been extreme, but the patterns they established continue to reverberate in the present day. Understanding this history, is a necessary step in dismantling the systems that still oppress and exploit women, and it's a call to action for the future. Having explored the political, social, and emotional consequences of royal sexual power, it's time to consider the legacy that such practices left on history itself. The medieval kings who used their sexuality to maintain their power didn't just shape the lives of women, they shaped the very structure of society, embedding systems of patriarchal control and sexual dominance into the fabric of the kingdom. The long-term repercussions of these actions influenced the way that future generations would perceive gender roles, power dynamics, and the legitimacy of authority. The royal court, as a microcosm of medieval society, became a breeding ground for these toxic power dynamics. The king's ability to control and manipulate sexual relationships set a precedent for all levels of society. If kings could use their sexual power to dominate women, then the same logic was applied to the relationships between lords and peasants, masters and servants. The social structures that allowed for this exploitation didn't simply end with the fall of the monarchy. Instead, they evolved into more subtle, insidious forms of control, still operating in the background of everyday life. One of the most enduring legacies of medieval sexual politics was the idea that women's bodies were not their own. They were possessions first of their fathers, then of their husbands or kings. This dehumanizing belief shaped not only how women were treated in the royal court, but also how they were treated in everyday society. Women were often valued for their ability to bear children and fulfill sexual roles, but they were not given autonomy over their own lives or bodies. Their worth was determined by their relationship to the men in power, and this set a precedent that would persist for centuries. The continued legacy of this control over women's bodies is evident in the centuries-long battle for women's rights. From the suffragist movements in the 19th and 20th centuries to today's ongoing fight for reproductive rights and gender equality, the struggle against the historical control of women's bodies has been long and difficult. The patriarchal systems that were solidified during medieval times may have evolved, but the basic concepts of control and dominance over women's autonomy still exist today. This legacy, though often hidden behind more modern facades, continues to affect the lives of women around the world. Moreover, the exploitation of women in the royal courts wasn't just about sex, it was about control over their lives, their choices, and their destinies. Kings and other rulers had the power to decide who a woman married when she gave birth, and even who she slept with. This level of control extended far beyond personal preference. It was political. The control of women's reproductive systems became a tool for the monarchy to ensure that their bloodlines continued, that their reigns were unchallenged, and that their power remained absolute. Looking at history from this lens, it's clear that the concept of royal sexual power has had a long-lasting impact on the world. The idea that power and control could be asserted through sexual dominance didn't just vanish with the end of feudalism. It evolved into new forms of societal control, often under the guise of tradition, religion, or even love. The residual effects of these power dynamics can still be seen today in the ways women are treated in many parts of the world, where their bodies are often used as instruments of political, social, and economic power. While many of the more overt abuses of royal sexual control have been relegated to history, the emotional, cultural, and political damage inflicted upon generations of women continues to resonate. The silence surrounding the exploitation of women during this time has contributed to the erasure of their experiences from mainstream historical narratives. Their suffering, their trauma, and their forced submission to royal desires were often overshadowed by the glorious tales of kings, queens, and conquests. But as we reflect on these stories, we must also acknowledge the women who lived and died under the oppressive weight of sexual control. Their experiences, though often forgotten, are integral to understanding the full picture of royal power and the lasting effects of its abuse. Historians and scholars continue to explore these aspects of medieval life, piecing together the stories of those who lived through it. But the true legacy of these practices is one that cannot be easily untangled. It is a legacy that lives on in the systems of power that still affect women's lives today. As we confront the history of royal sexuality, we are forced to reckon with the ways in which these abuses shaped the modern world. And, perhaps most importantly, we are called to continue fighting for a future where women's bodies are no longer treated as tools for men's dominance, but as sites of agency, autonomy, and respect. In the final stretch of this journey through the dark and complex relationship between medieval royalty and sexuality, we must confront the way these practices were justified and perpetuated across generations. Kings weren't merely acting out of personal desire. Their actions were deeply embedded in the political, religious, and cultural systems that governed the medieval world. The relationship between sex, power, and politics wasn't just a product of individual monarchs, it was a reflection of a broader societal belief in absolute male authority and control. The pervasive belief in the divine right of kings played a crucial role in legitimizing these sexual excesses. Kings were not just seen as earthly rulers, they were thought to be chosen by God, ordained to wield power over both their subjects and the land they ruled. This divine mandate meant that kings could act without consequence, even in the most intimate and personal matters. Sexual transgressions, especially those involving women, were often viewed as mere extensions of royal prerogative rather than abuses of power. The idea that the king's sexual behavior was a sacred right was deeply ingrained in the minds of the people, making it difficult to challenge or even question. The church, too, played a complicated role in this system of control. While the church theoretically preached chastity and moral restraint, it often turned a blind eye to the excesses of the monarchy. In some cases, the church even helped legitimize the sexual behaviors of kings, offering blessings for marriages, mistresses, and concubines alike. The alliance between the monarchy and the church ensured that the king's sexual power was seen not only as politically acceptable, but as divinely sanctioned. This gave the monarchs an incredible degree of freedom, not just in their political dealings, but in their personal sexual lives as well. The influence of the church was not limited to providing moral justification. It also played a significant role in reinforcing the monarchy's view of women as mere tools for reproduction and political advantage. Female sexuality was tightly controlled by both the monarchy and the church. Women were seen as vessels for heirs, and their sexual activity was dictated by the needs of the monarchy. Whether it was a queen fulfilling her duty to produce a male heir, or a concubine used to cement political alliances, women were expected to serve the royal family by bearing children, often at the cost of their own personal autonomy. But these practices didn't just remain confined to the halls of power. They permeated throughout society, reinforcing the patriarchal structures that would persist for centuries. If kings and noblemen could exert such control over the sexual lives of their wives, concubines, and mistresses, it was not surprising that these attitudes were mirrored in the treatment of women in the broader population. In many ways, the sexual exploitation of royal women set the stage for the widespread normalization of gender-based violence and inequality in medieval society. This system of sexual control also had a profound psychological impact on the women involved. For many, their worth was defined by their ability to fulfill their sexual and reproductive roles. Their bodies were not their own, but rather the property of the king or the nobleman to whom they belonged. The emotional toll of living in a world where their value was entirely tied to their ability to produce heirs was immeasurable. These women were not seen as individuals with desires and autonomy, they were viewed as tools, used to serve the needs of the monarchy and the political structure it upheld. Even those women who gained power in the royal court through their relationships with kings were often trapped in the same system. Whether it was a mistress who gained influence or a queen who held sway over the political affairs of the kingdom, their power was always fragile. They were always vulnerable to being replaced by younger, more fertile women, or to being cast aside if their usefulness waned. Their position in the court was never secure, and their worth was continually measured by their ability to fulfill their reproductive duties. Historians continue to study the long-lasting effects of these power dynamics. Some suggest that the practices we've described were less common than often believed, perhaps exaggerated over time. However, the core truth remains. The sexual exploitation of women was not just a consequence of individual kings' actions, but a product of a deeply entrenched system of patriarchal power. The legacy of this system is still evident today in the gender inequalities that persist across societies. The battle for gender equality and sexual autonomy is still ongoing. The structures of power that were solidified during the medieval period have evolved, but the core issues remain. Women's bodies continue to be the site of political struggles, from reproductive rights to sexual violence. The centuries of sexual control practiced by medieval kings, reinforced by both secular and religious institutions, laid the groundwork for the systems of oppression that women continue to face. While the monarchy may no longer exist in the same form, the echoes of medieval sexual politics still reverberate in contemporary society. As we look back at this dark chapter of history, we must acknowledge the lasting impact it has had on gender relations, power dynamics, and the fight for women's autonomy. The legacy of royal sexuality is not just a relic of the past, it is a reminder of the continued need for social change, advocacy, and the pursuit of justice for those whose bodies have long been under the control of patriarchal systems. As we look to the future, it's crucial to understand how the sexual politics of medieval royalty have shaped modern society in ways that are still deeply ingrained. The systems of patriarchal power, control over women's bodies, and the normalization of sexual dominance were not fleeting aspects of medieval kingship. They set a template for the cultural, social, and political structures that would continue to affect societies long after the fall of monarchy. The transformation of royal sexual exploitation into societal norms was a gradual, yet profound, process. Over time, the public role of women and the public nature of sexuality evolved, but the fundamental idea that men held power over women remained firmly in place. This was particularly evident in the way that sexual violence and exploitation were framed as tools of power, not just in the royal court, but throughout the feudal system and into later generations. Kings who used their sexuality to maintain their rule set, an example that was followed by the elite, and eventually became a cultural norm that was embedded in the laws and customs of many societies. The parallels between the medieval period and the modern world are evident in the ongoing struggles for women's rights, sexual autonomy, and gender equality. The concepts of male control over women's bodies, whether through marriage, sexual violence, or the limiting of reproductive rights, are not relics of a past era. They continue to shape political discourse, social policies, and even personal relationships today. Whether it's the fight for reproductive rights or the push to end sexual violence, the legacy of royal control over women's bodies serves as a reminder of how deeply these issues are embedded in our collective history. In addition, the way in which women were dehumanized in the medieval courts has resonated through centuries of cultural narratives. Women were viewed not as individuals, but as property tools to secure political alliances, ensure royal bloodlines, and serve the king's desires. This dehumanization was a core feature of medieval royal sexuality, and it continues to influence modern attitudes toward women. Even today, women are often still viewed in terms of their relationship to male power, whether as daughters, wives, or mothers. Their value is often measured by their sexual attractiveness, their ability to bear children, and their role in maintaining the family structure. The lasting effects of this system are not just theoretical, they are deeply felt in contemporary politics, social norms, and personal relationships. Women's bodies continue to be battlegrounds for political and ideological battles, with their reproductive rights, sexual autonomy, and overall agency often contested by those in power. The fight for gender equality, for the end of sexual violence, and for reproductive justice is a continuation of the struggle against the historical systems that dehumanized women and reduced them to instruments of power. However, this struggle is not without hope. As we confront the legacy of medieval sexual control, we must also acknowledge the progress that has been made. Women's rights movements, the rise of feminist activism, and the growing recognition of sexual violence as a serious issue have all played crucial roles in shifting societal attitudes. While there is still much work to be done, there is growing recognition that women's bodies must be treated with respect, dignity, and autonomy, not as objects to be controlled by political or sexual forces. The history we've explored serves as both a warning and a call to action. The legacy of medieval kingship, with its systematic abuse of power and control over women's sexuality, is a part of the past that we cannot afford to forget. By understanding the deeply rooted structures that perpetuated these abuses, we can work to dismantle the systems that still allow for the exploitation and subjugation of women today. As we move forward, it is essential that we continue to fight for a world where women's sexual autonomy is no longer a political tool but a fundamental right. This is the ultimate lesson to be drawn from the history of royal sexual control. The battle for women's autonomy is not a new fight. It is an ongoing struggle, one that has roots in centuries of exploitation, but one that can be won through collective action, solidarity, and an unwavering commitment to equality. The fight for women's autonomy, particularly their control over their own bodies, has been a long and hard-fought battle. But as we reflect on the legacy of royal sexual power and the institutionalized exploitation that permeated medieval courts, we must also recognize how the resistance against such systems has shaped the modern feminist movement. The stories of royal mistresses, concubines, and queens who were subjected to sexual dominance by kings are not just stories of subjugation. They are the foundations of the resistance movements that began to emerge centuries later, as women began to reclaim their voices and their rights. The recognition of sexual autonomy as a fundamental right did not happen overnight, nor was it inevitable. It took centuries of struggle, both on the part of individual women and broader social movements, to begin dismantling the power structures that had been built to control women's bodies. The same patriarchal systems that allowed kings to wield their sexual power over women also created the conditions that kept women in positions of inferiority for generations. But the fight for sexual freedom has always been a central aspect of the fight for women's rights. Feminist movements, starting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, began to challenge the very structures that were rooted in centuries of royal sexual control. Early suffragists and women's rights advocates fought not just for the right to vote, but for the right to control their own bodies, to be free from the violence and sexual exploitation that had long been part of the societal fabric. They recognized that true equality could not be achieved until women had autonomy over their sexuality, their reproductive choices, and their ability to say no to those in power. The cultural shifts that followed were not without setbacks, and the work of feminists over the years is still ongoing. The continued struggle for reproductive rights, the fight to end sexual violence, and the ongoing fight for equal pay and recognition are all part of the broader struggle to dismantle the legacy of medieval royal sexual power. Today, the fight for women's sexual autonomy is closely tied to the fight for justice, equality, and dignity. It is not just about breaking free from the shackles of past systems of exploitation. It's about creating a world where women's bodies are no longer seen as tools to assert power, but as autonomous spaces that belong solely to the women who inhabit them. One of the most powerful outcomes of the modern feminist movement has been the ability to name the abuses that have long been hidden in plain sight. The conversations around sexual violence, harassment, and reproductive rights are part of a broader reckoning with centuries of injustice. As we look back at the way kings and monarchs used sexuality as a political tool, it becomes clear that the resistance against such practices is deeply ingrained in the fight for women's rights today. Yet, despite the progress, the battle is far from over. The rise of modern authoritarianism, the rollback of reproductive rights in many parts of the world, and the persistence of patriarchal control in social and political spheres remind us that the past still exerts influence. The fight for sexual autonomy, for the right to say no and to have control over one's body, is as urgent now as it ever has been. The lessons of history, the exploitation, control, and abuse of women by those in power serve as both a warning and a rallying cry. The story of medieval sexual politics isn't just an historical footnote. It's a living history that still shapes the fight for equality today. Understanding this history is crucial because it provides context for the struggles that women face today. It allows us to recognize the ongoing fight against sexual violence, reproductive control, and the ongoing battle for women's full autonomy in all areas of life. As we push forward, we must continue to learn from the past, ensuring that the lessons of sexual exploitation and patriarchal dominance never repeat. This history has been written by the powerful kings, monarchs, and patriarchs who have used their sexual power to assert dominance over women. But the future can and must be different. The fight for women's autonomy, equality, and freedom is far from over. But with each step forward, we break the chains of the past. The ongoing struggles for women's rights, particularly regarding sexual autonomy and reproductive freedom, are deeply intertwined with the historical legacies we've explored. As we approach the end of this historical journey, it's important to recognize that these legacies are not just confined to the distant past, they continue to reverberate through the present day, shaping the policies, cultural norms, and power dynamics that govern our world. The medieval system that allowed kings to claim absolute control over the bodies of women laid the groundwork for modern systems of patriarchal power and control, systems that persist in many ways today. In examining these historical practices, it becomes clear that the quest for women's autonomy, especially over their own sexuality, has always been an inherently political struggle. The medieval monarchs who exploited their sexual power were not just acting as rulers, they were perpetuating a larger system of gender-based oppression, one in which the control of women's bodies was central to maintaining their authority. This system didn't just affect the royal court, it reached far into society, normalizing the idea that men had the right to control women's lives, sexual experiences, and reproductive choices. While medieval kings used sexual violence and coercion as tools of control, today, the struggle for women's sexual rights takes on a different, though still profoundly urgent form. The political battles surrounding reproductive rights, access to contraception, and the right to make decisions about one's own body are all rooted in the very same fight for autonomy that women have faced for centuries. Just as medieval monarchs saw women's bodies as theirs to control, modern politicians and societal structures still often treat women's reproductive choices as a matter for state control or political manipulation. Today, the consequences of this historical legacy are particularly apparent in the debates surrounding reproductive health and rights. Across the globe, women continue to fight for the right to choose whether or not to have children, the right to safe and accessible healthcare, and the right to control their sexual experiences without interference from powerful political or religious forces. These struggles are a direct continuation of the battle against the sexual domination of women by the medieval kings and their courts. The same systems that saw women's bodies as tools of political power are now expressed in laws, policies, and societal norms that restrict women's access to reproductive health care, perpetuate the stigma surrounding women's sexuality, and deny them the right to control their own bodies. The fact that these struggles are still ongoing reflects the deep roots of patriarchy. The sexual politics that kings used to dominate their courts and maintain their power were not just a byproduct of medieval society, they were integral to the functioning of that society. And though the medieval monarchy no longer exists, the systems that supported it and the power dynamics it created continue to influence modern society in ways that are sometimes subtle, but always profound. The fight for sexual autonomy today is not just about individual freedoms, it is about dismantling centuries of historical injustice. It's about confronting the legacy of monarchs who treated women as property and reasserting the belief that women's bodies belong to them, not to the state, not to their husbands, and not to the whims of any powerful figure. The history of medieval sexual exploitation is a reminder of how deeply embedded systems of oppression can be, and how long it takes to challenge and undo them. But this is not a hopeless fight. The progress made by the feminist movement, particularly in the realms of reproductive rights, sexual autonomy, and the breaking down of patriarchal structures, is proof that change is possible. The women who fought in the past, often in silence or at great personal cost, have paved the way for future generations. Today, we stand on the shoulders of these women, carrying forward their fight for equality, justice, and the right to control our own bodies. As we move toward a future where women's rights are more fully realized, it's important that we remain vigilant, drawing on the lessons of history to ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. The exploitation of women by medieval monarchs may seem far removed from the struggles we face today, but the root causes the abuse of power, the control over women's bodies, and the denial of their agency remain all too familiar. It is only through continued resistance, solidarity, and a commitment to justice that we can hope to create a world where women's autonomy is respected, valued, and protected. As we conclude this exploration of royal sexual politics, it is essential to reflect on the broader implications of what we've uncovered. The control of women's sexuality and bodies in medieval royal courts was not merely an isolated event, it was part of a wider system of patriarchal oppression that has endured through centuries. From the manipulation of royal bloodlines to the systematic sexual exploitation of women, the medieval monarchy set a precedent for power dynamics that would echo throughout history. The legacy of these practices is still present in the modern world, shaping the way we understand power, gender, and control. What we see in the medieval period is a clear reflection of how power operates in societies, how it manifests in the most intimate aspects of life, including sexual relationships. Kings were not just political figures, they were symbols of absolute authority, and their control over their own sexuality and the bodies of others was a manifestation of that power. The exploitation and subjugation of women, seen as tools for reproduction, political leverage, or personal pleasure, were essential to maintaining that authority. The king's actions were seen as beyond reproach, with his sexual power legitimized by his position and the divine right that supposedly justified his rule. Yet, in acknowledging the cruelty and violence of these systems, we must also recognize the resilience of women throughout history. Despite being reduced to objects in the royal court, women found ways to resist, challenge, and survive within these systems. Queens, mistresses, and concubines, though often treated as pawns, sometimes wielded their own power, shaping the political landscape in ways that were not always immediately apparent. While they were subject to the whims of the king, many found ways to secure influence, protect their children, or even resist their exploitation. These women, though largely erased from history, laid the foundation for the feminist movements that would come centuries later, fighting for autonomy, equality, and the right to control their own destinies. Today, we stand at a crossroads in the ongoing fight for gender equality. The battles fought by those before us against sexual exploitation, reproductive control, and patriarchal dominance are far from over. While significant progress has been made in many areas, we continue to confront the remnants of these medieval systems of control. The struggles for reproductive rights, sexual autonomy, and gender equality are directly linked to the historical legacies of royal sexual power and patriarchal oppression. The systems that were once justified by divine right or political necessity still operate today, albeit in different forms. However, the continued fight for women's rights is not just about confronting historical injustices, it's about building a future where women have complete autonomy over their own bodies. The lessons from history, particularly from the darkest chapters of royal sexual politics, remind us of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of holding those in power accountable. Women's bodies should never again be seen as tools to further someone else's desires, and the fight for gender equality must continue until all women can live freely, with dignity and control over their own lives. As we move forward, it is essential that we honor the history of resistance, struggle, and survival that has been hidden in the shadows for so long. The women who lived through these abuses, whether they were queens, concubines, or commoners, deserve to have their stories remembered. Their resilience should serve as inspiration for all of us as we continue to push for a more just and equitable world. The legacy of royal sexual power may be dark, but it is through confronting and understanding this history that we can build a brighter future. Finally, let us remember that the fight for women's rights is not a solitary battle. It is one that requires solidarity, collective action, and a commitment to justice. The voices of those who have been silenced by history, whether they were royal mistresses or common women, must be heard, and their struggles should guide us as we work to dismantle the systems that perpetuate gender inequality. The path forward will not be easy, but it is through continued resistance, activism, and solidarity that we can create a world where women's rights are truly respected and their bodies are no longer subject to the control of others. Sweet dreams.